Hi everybody, Dana Sparks, broker of Maximum One Greater Atlanta Realtors, and today's contract tip has to do with making a contract subject to due diligence versus subject with right to request repairs. So basically, the majority of contracts that we see nowadays are buyers and sellers going under contract for a property and making that contract subject to due diligence. I've done several videos on due diligence, so let me just briefly talk about that here. If a buyer and a seller go under contract and do not make it subject to due diligence, then the buyer is agreeing to purchase the property as is with all faults. If a buyer and a seller go under contract, making the contract subject to due diligence, the seller is granting the buyer the option to terminate the contract. There's no word about an inspection. It's just the right to terminate the contract. Now, there are several things that a buyer will do to make the decision if they're going to proceed with the contract or terminate. One of those many things that a buyer will do will be to have inspections, various inspections done with the property, including an independent home inspection from an inspector. Also, during this time frame, in order for a buyer to make the decision whether they are going to terminate or go through, the buyer has the option of asking the seller to address various concerns that the buyer has with the property. The seller can say, nope, I'm not doing anything, or the seller can say, yes, I'll do this and this, but not that and that, or the seller can do whatever the buyer has asked. Now, this amendment under which the buyer and the seller negotiate these items to address these concerns, this is an amendment, and it is just like any other amendment to a contract. It's if the buyer and the seller agree, and then the seller agrees to perform those typically it's repairs or replacement of items. If the buyer and the seller don't agree, then it's not part of the contract. Now again, these are just things that a buyer does before the due diligence period terminates in order for that buyer to make the decision to terminate or not. There's no time limit on this amendment to address concerns. It's simply an issue of incentive. If we go past the buyer's due diligence time frame and the buyer has not terminated, then there's absolutely no incentive, contractual incentive, for a seller to do any repair items the buyer's requested, but a seller absolutely may. If we are before the end of the due diligence time frame and the buyer has not terminated, there is a little more incentive for the seller to perhaps perform some of those repairs just to keep this buyer in contract. Excuse me. But the due diligence period is just a termination option. And an inspection is optional and the seller is not required to do anything. Now, there is a whole nother way that a buyer and a seller may go under contract. They may go under contract making the property sold with the right to request repairs. Not an option to request repairs, but the right to request repairs. And if you do this, then you're not going to make it subject to due diligence. So you're not going to mark that box, due diligence or buyer's right to term frame, buyer's right to terminate, but there is a completely separate GAR exhibit. Now this is just in the GAR contract form. I have not seen this in the RE contract form package, but there is a separate exhibit, and it is exhibit 273, property sold with right to request repairs. Say that 3 times fast. Exhibit. And this is basically, it says the buyer shall have the right to request that the seller repair and or replace defects, if any, in the property identified by the buyer's inspectors in written reports within so many days. So again, you would negotiate the time frame from the binding agreement date. The buyer shall provide the seller with an amendment to the agreement requesting that the defects be repaired or replaced, and they're required to present a copy of the reports from the inspectors. If you go past that time frame that you negotiate, then the buyer's agreeing to buy the property as is. So you present an amendment of repairs along with the inspector's report. And the seller and the buyer negotiate through these repair items. If, and again, there's some time frames. So you negotiate back and forth through these time frames. If the parties agree, then the seller is obligated to perform those repairs. If not, the buyer either has the right to terminate, or the buyer may proceed and accept the property as is. Now, the inspector is a specific professional expertise, a professional who has expertise in property inspections or an item or specific building product. Defect shall mean any infestation by termites, insects, other wood-destroying organisms of any condition, or a condition that presents a significant health risk or imminent risk of injury or damage, constitutes a violation of current laws or governmental codes as long as those codes weren't grandfathered in, and is not at the present time in good working order except for normal wear and tear. So the reason I'm bringing this up to you, and then the corresponding amendment, so that's the exhibit that you would use for the buyer and the seller to go under contract. And then the corresponding exhibit you would use is GAR F722, Amendment to Remove Inspection Contingency. Now this amendment is not to be used if the parties go under contract subject to due diligence. It is only to be used if the parties go under contract subject to right to request repairs. It sounds a little bit confusing because it sounds very similar. The difference is under a due diligence period, the buyer has the right to terminate for any or no reason and doesn't have to provide the reason. Just within that time frame, it is a mini option contract within the broader context of the whole purchase and sale agreement. If a buyer and a seller go under contract subject to the right to request repairs, then the only way the buyer may terminate is if the buyer provides this amendment to the seller to repair or replace these defective items as defined in this exhibit, and if the seller does not agree to repair or replace those defective items, then the buyer may terminate. But if the seller agrees to repair or replace those, the buyer does not have the right to terminate. So it's not an option contract. The buyer is buying this house subject specifically to inspection with a report provided by specific inspectors. For those of you that have been practicing real estate in Georgia for a while, probably over 20 years maybe, the GAR contracts used to be subject solely to inspection. We never had the due diligence period. The buyer could not terminate the contract for any or no reason. It only was if the buyer and the seller could not negotiate through those repairs. So that's what this is. But the reason I'm bringing it up to you is, number one, to let you know it's available to you in the GAR contracts, and number two, so there's no confusion. Because when you are using the GAR forms and you see this amendment to remove inspection contingency amendment, this is not the amendment to use when a buyer is buying the property subject to due diligence. Yes, a buyer may have inspections done in order to make that determination if they're going to terminate, but due diligence is an option to terminate, period, for any reason whatsoever. In this, the buyer may only terminate if the seller does not agree to perform the repairs as negotiated between the two. So I hope this contract tip helped you out. Please read through those forms before you and the buyer decide to make a contract subject to this. Make sure that you have a thorough discussion with the buyer, understanding the difference between making a contract subject to due diligence and making a contract sold subject to right to request repairs. Thank you guys so much for watching. Dana Sparks, broker of Maximum One Greater Atlanta Realtors, satisfying your needs with service, innovation, and education.